What if I told you that hidden within medieval manuscripts lies a systematic catalog of 72 ancient entities, beings that were once revered as gods, then demonized by emerging religions? And what if these same entities hold psychological secrets that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to decode? Greetings, seekers of ancient wisdom. Today we're diving deep into one of history's most controversial and misunderstood texts, the Ars Goetia. But this isn't just another surface-level exploration. We're going to uncover the real story, the hidden history they don't teach you in religious studies, and the profound psychological truths that lie beneath centuries of fear and superstition. By the end of this journey, you'll never see ancient grimoire the same way again. You'll discover that what you thought were medieval demon catalogs are actually sophisticated maps of human consciousness, and you might just unlock aspects of yourself you never knew existed. The Ars Goetia, also known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, first appeared in written form during the 17th century. But its roots stretch back thousands of years into the mists of pre-Christian antiquity. What most people don't realize is that this isn't just some medieval book of demon summoning. It's actually a sophisticated psychological technology that maps the hidden depths of human consciousness. Imagine walking through a vast library where every book contains a different aspect of your own mind. That's what the Goetia really is. A catalog of the 72 fundamental psychological patterns that exist within every human being. The 72 spirits described in the Goetia weren't originally considered evil entities. They were ancient deities, nature spirits, and archetypal forces that represented different aspects of the human psyche and the natural world. When Christianity rose to power, these beings needed to be reframed, transformed from gods into demons to align with the new religious paradigm. But here's what's really fascinating. Modern depth psychology, particularly the work of Carl Jung, reveals that these so-called demons are actually symbolic representations of what Jung called the collective unconscious, universal patterns of human experience that exist within all of us. Picture your consciousness as an iceberg. The small visible portion represents your everyday awareness, but beneath the surface lies a vast underwater mountain of psychological potential. The spirits of the Goetia are like diving guides, showing you how to explore those hidden depths. Let's go deeper into the historical reality, because what I'm about to share will shatter everything you think you know about medieval magic. The name Goetia itself comes from the Greek word Goetia, meaning sorcery or witchcraft. But the original Greek concept was far more nuanced than our modern understanding suggests. In ancient Greece, a gose was a practitioner of folk magic, someone who worked with the spirits of the land and the ancestors. Here's a story that perfectly illustrates what we're dealing with. In 1904, a young Oxford student named Arthur Edward Waite discovered a crumbling manuscript in the British Library. As he carefully opened the ancient pages, he expected to find primitive superstition. Instead, he found something that would change his understanding of consciousness forever. Systematic descriptions of psychological states so advanced that modern psychology wouldn't catch up for another century. The text we know today as the Ars Goetia was compiled from much older sources. Some scholars trace elements back to the Testament of Solomon, written sometime between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. This earlier text described how King Solomon used a magical ring to bind demons and force them to build his temple. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where most mainstream historians stop digging. The original sources weren't about binding evil spirits at all. They were preservation techniques, ways for pre-Christian wisdom keepers to maintain their spiritual technologies under the new religious order. By framing their practices as the binding of demons, they could continue their work while appearing to conform to Christian doctrine. Think of it as an elaborate code, like resistance fighters during wartime creating secret messages that looked like innocent correspondence. The medieval mystics were doing the same thing with consciousness technology. Let's go deeper into the psychological architecture, because this is where most people's minds get completely blown. The real genius of the Ars Goetia lies in its systematic approach to consciousness exploration. Each of the 72 spirits represents a specific psychological function or life domain. Take Bael, the first spirit listed, described as having 3 heads: a man, a cat, and a toad. Bael represents the integration of human consciousness, intuitive knowing, and earthly wisdom. But here's the part almost no one dares to say. When you work with these archetypal patterns, you're not summoning external entities. You're awakening dormant aspects of your own consciousness that have been sleeping your entire life. Modern practitioners who work with these systems report that invoking Bael helps with leadership challenges, strategic thinking, and connecting with one's authentic power. The 3-headed imagery isn't literal. It's a symbolic map, showing how different types of awareness need to be integrated for effective decision-making. Imagine your mind as a vast theater with 72 different actors, each capable of playing a specific role in the drama of your life. Most people only ever use 5 or 6 of these actors, leaving enormous creative potential untapped. Or consider Paimon, often portrayed as a man riding a camel, preceded by a host of spirits, playing musical instruments. Paimon's traditional domain includes teaching arts and sciences, revealing hidden treasures, and providing familiar spirits. In psychological terms, Paimon represents the archetype of the teacher, the part of consciousness that synthesizes knowledge and makes it accessible to others. What the ancient compilers of these texts understood was that human consciousness isn't monolithic. We contain multitudes, different aspects of self that emerge in different contexts. The Goetia provides a map for navigating and integrating these various aspects. You feel this every day without realizing it. The part of you that emerges in crisis situations versus the part that shows up at family gatherings. The aspect of yourself that creates art versus the one that handles business negotiations. These aren't random personality shifts. They're different archetypal patterns activating within your consciousness. But let's go even deeper, into the suppressed historical context that changes everything. Because what I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you've been taught about Western spirituality. During the medieval period, when the Ars Goetia was being compiled and transmitted, Europe was undergoing massive spiritual and intellectual upheaval. The old pagan traditions were being systematically suppressed, but the wisdom they contained couldn't simply disappear. It had to go underground. Picture a vast network of hidden libraries, secret schools, and coded manuscripts, all preserving knowledge that could get you burned at the stake if discovered. This wasn't just academic preservation. This was a spiritual resistance movement that understood consciousness technologies too valuable to lose. The grimoire tradition, including the Ars Goetia, served as this underground preservation system. Scholars, mystics, and folk practitioners found ways to encode their knowledge in forms that would survive persecution. By presenting their practices as the commanding of evil spirits rather than the honoring of ancient gods, they created a protective camouflage. This is why so many of the spirits in the Goetia retain attributes of pre-Christian deities. Astaroth, for example, described as a great duke of hell who appears as an angel, is clearly derived from the ancient Near Eastern goddess Astarte or Ishtar. The transformation from love goddess to demon duchess represents the systematic demonization of feminine spiritual power that characterized the medieval period. But here's where it gets truly shocking. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that the psychological technologies preserved in the Goetia were originally developed in ancient mystery schools that existed thousands of years before Christianity. We're not just looking at medieval manuscripts. We're looking at the encoded remnants of humanity's oldest consciousness exploration programs. Ancient mystery schools understood something that modern Western culture has largely forgotten: that consciousness is multidimensional and that different states of awareness provide access to different types of knowledge and capability. The spirits of the Goetia represent different doorways into these alternative states of consciousness. Now here's where modern science begins to catch up with ancient wisdom. And this is the part that will completely revolutionize how you understand your own mind. Contemporary neuroscience has discovered that the brain operates through multiple processing systems. We have conscious and unconscious minds, logical and intuitive processing, individual and collective awareness. The latest research in psychology recognizes that healthy individuals naturally shift between different personality states depending on context and need. Imagine if I told you that your brain contains neural networks that correspond exactly to the archetypal patterns described in ancient texts written over 1,000 years ago. You'd think I was making it up, but that's exactly what modern neuroscience is discovering. What the ancient authors of the Goetia called summoning spirits might be better understood as accessing specific cognitive and emotional resources. When someone works with the spirit Andromalius, described as a great earl who appears as a man holding a serpent, they're essentially engaging with the psychological functions associated with justice, truth-seeking, and the revelation of hidden wrongdoing. The elaborate rituals described in the Goetia, the circles, the invocations, the specific timing. These aren't superstitious practices. They're sophisticated psychological technologies designed to shift consciousness into specific states. The ritualistic elements serve to bypass the rational mind and access deeper levels of awareness. Carl Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon. He recognized that the symbols and practices of traditional magic were actually methods for engaging with what he called the archetypal layer of the psyche. Jung himself used a practice he called active imagination to dialogue with inner figures that bore striking similarities to the spirits described in magical grimoires. But here's the part that will blow your mind. Jung's patients who engaged with these archetypal figures showed measurable improvements in psychological health, creativity, and life satisfaction. The magic wasn't supernatural. It was neurological. You can feel this happening in your own life. Think about moments when you've accessed unusual clarity, creativity, or courage. Those weren't random fluctuations. Those were different archetypal patterns activating within your consciousness. The Goetia provides a systematic method for accessing these states intentionally. Before we dive into the most advanced applications of this ancient technology, I want to ask you something. How many aspects of your own psychological potential do you think you've actually explored? If this resonates with you so far, if you're feeling that tingle of recognition as these pieces fall into place, hit that subscribe button now, because we're just getting started. I release deep dives like this every week, revealing the hidden connections between ancient wisdom and cutting-edge psychology. And trust me, what's coming next will change how you see yourself forever. Let's go deeper into specific examples that demonstrate the psychological sophistication of this system. Because when you understand how these patterns actually work, you'll realize you've been sitting on a goldmine of untapped potential your entire life. Take the spirit Vasago, described as a mighty prince who declares things past, present, and future, and discovers hidden treasures. In psychological terms, Vasago represents the intuitive function, the aspect of consciousness that synthesizes information in non-linear ways and arrives at insights that purely logical thinking cannot reach. Here's a true story that perfectly illustrates this. A successful business consultant I know began working with the Vasago archetype during a particularly challenging project. Instead of relying solely on data analysis and logical reasoning, she began accessing what she called her Vasago state, a mode of consciousness characterized by relaxed awareness and pattern recognition. Within weeks, she was making strategic recommendations that seemed to come from nowhere but proved remarkably accurate. Her colleagues thought she had developed supernatural business intuition. In reality, she had simply learned to access neural networks that most people never consciously engage. People who work with Vasago report enhanced intuitive abilities, better capacity for pattern recognition, and improved access to subconscious knowledge. The treasures that Vasago reveals aren't necessarily material. They're often insights, creative solutions, or hidden aspects of situations that become clearer through intuitive knowing. Or consider Phoenix, described as a great marquis, appearing as the phoenix bird. Phoenix is said to have an excellent voice and to sing sweet notes. In the mythological system, Phoenix teaches wonderful sciences and will return after 1,200 years to resume his place in the phoenix, of course, is the universal symbol of transformation through destruction and rebirth. Working with Phoenix represents engaging with the psychological process of transformation, letting go of old identities and patterns to allow new capacities to emerge. The sweet voice represents the harmonious integration that occurs when transformation is approached with wisdom rather than resistance. You've experienced Phoenix energy without realizing it. Those moments when you've had to let go of something important and discovered unexpected strength and wisdom in the process. The breakup that led to self-discovery, the job loss that opened new possibilities, the crisis that revealed hidden resources. These aren't random life events. They're archetypal patterns playing out in your personal experience. These aren't random symbolic associations. The medieval compilers of these texts were encoding sophisticated understandings of psychological development and spiritual growth that modern therapy is only beginning to rediscover. But here's what's really extraordinary. And this is where most people get it completely wrong, because the traditional approach has been backwards for centuries. The traditional approach to the Goetia involves elaborate protective measures, circles, pentagrams, binding oaths. The practitioner is instructed to approach these spirits with authority and to command them rather than simply communicate. This has led to centuries of fearful and adversarial relationships with these archetypal forces. But what if the entire framework is based on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if the very approach that's been taught for generations actually prevents you from accessing the real benefits of this system? Picture trying to develop a relationship with a wise mentor by shouting commands at them and drawing protective barriers between yourself and their wisdom. You'd never access their real insights that way. And yet, that's exactly how most people approach these archetypal patterns. Modern practitioners who approach these systems with respect, rather than domination, report profoundly different experiences. Instead of rebellious demons that must be bound and controlled, they encounter aspects of consciousness that are eager to collaborate in personal development and creative expression. The adversarial approach reflects the dualistic thinking that dominated medieval Christianity. The idea that spiritual and psychological forces are either good or evil, with no middle ground. But the original pagan traditions that influenced these texts understood spirit and psyche as neutral forces that could be worked with constructively. When someone approaches Bael, described as a mighty king who appears riding a pale horse with trumpeters before him, with respect rather than commanding authority, they often find that Bael represents the regal aspect of self, the capacity for dignified leadership. Imagine if you approached your own creativity, leadership ability, or healing capacity as enemies to be controlled, rather than resources to be developed. You'd never access their full potential. Yet, that's exactly what traditional Goetic practice teaches people to do with their own psychological resources. The key insight here is that these archetypal forces exist within you. We're not summoning external entities. We're engaging with different aspects of our own consciousness. The medieval framework of binding and commanding was a reflection of the split between conscious and unconscious mind that characterizes Western psychology. But integration, rather than domination, leads to far more sustainable and beneficial outcomes. Let's go even deeper into the actual historical development of the text itself, because understanding how this knowledge was preserved reveals something profound about human consciousness and its relationship to wisdom traditions. The version of the Ars Goetia that most people are familiar with comes from the 17th century manuscript tradition, particularly the versions preserved in the British Library and other European archives. But these manuscripts represent the endpoint of a long process of compilation and revision that spans millennia. Think of these texts as rivers carrying wisdom from multiple ancient sources. The earliest identifiable tributaries include the Testament of Solomon, which describes how the great king used supernatural assistance in building the temple. But even this text draws on older streams: Babylonian and Assyrian magical practices, Egyptian ritual technologies, and Greek mystery religion techniques. What happened over the centuries was a gradual Christianization of much older spiritual practices. The original gods and spirits were reframed as demons to fit the new religious paradigm, but their essential functions and attributes remained largely intact. It's like taking a sophisticated computer program and changing the user interface while keeping the underlying code functional. This is why careful study of the Goetia reveals such sophisticated psychological and spiritual insights. The underlying wisdom comes from thousands of years of practical experience with consciousness-altering techniques and spiritual development practices. But here's what almost no one realizes. The medieval compilers weren't just collecting random folklore. They were preserving a coherent system of psychological and spiritual technology that had proven effective across multiple cultures and historical periods. Picture a vast underground university that existed across centuries, with scholars and practitioners in different countries and time periods, all contributing to the same body of knowledge. That's what the grimoire tradition really represents. Humanity's longest-running research project into the nature of consciousness and human potential. Here's something they definitely don't teach you in mainstream religious studies. And this revelation will change how you understand the entire Western esoteric tradition. The Ars Goetia wasn't just preserved by Christian scholars trying to understand pagan practices. It was actively maintained and developed by practitioners who understood its real value. Throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods, there were communities of scholars, mystics, and practical magicians who worked with these systems. Imagine a secret network of brilliant minds, philosophers, scientists, artists, and healers, all sharing discoveries about consciousness and human potential while maintaining public personas that wouldn't attract persecution. That's exactly what existed throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe. These communities included some of the most advanced thinkers of their time. Renaissance figures like Cornelius Agrippa, Johannes Trithemius, and John Dee were deeply familiar with grimoire literature and incorporated its insights into their broader intellectual work. These weren't superstitious amateurs. They were some of the most sophisticated minds of their era. The preservation of these texts required enormous effort and considerable personal risk. During periods of intense religious persecution, possession of grimoires could result in execution. The fact that these texts survived at all indicates how valuable practitioners found them. But here's the truly remarkable part. This wasn't just European preservation. What's particularly fascinating is how the system adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining its core functionality. Jewish practitioners integrated Goetic techniques with Kabbalistic theory. Islamic scholars incorporated similar approaches into their understanding of jinn and spiritual hierarchy. Even Christian mystics found ways to work with these archetypal forces within orthodox theological frameworks. This adaptability suggests that the underlying insights of the Goetia touch on universal aspects of human psychology and spiritual development that transcend specific religious or cultural boundaries. We're looking at discoveries about consciousness that are as fundamental as mathematical principles. They work the same way, regardless of cultural context. You can see this universality in your own experience. The archetypal patterns described in the Goetia, the wise teacher, the fierce warrior, the creative artist, the strategic leader. These show up in every culture throughout history because they reflect fundamental aspects of human psychological. Now let's explore how this ancient wisdom applies to modern life. Because once you understand these principles, you'll realize you've been living with access to extraordinary psychological resources that you never knew you had. Contemporary practitioners who work with Goetic systems report improvements in creativity, problem-solving ability, emotional regulation, and spiritual development. But these benefits don't come from literal demon summoning. They emerge from the systematic engagement with different aspects of consciousness that the Goetic framework provides. Consider the modern application of working with Zephyr, described as a great duke who appears as a soldier in red apparel and armor. Traditional texts say Zephyr causes women to love men and brings couples together. In contemporary psychological terms, Zephyr represents the aspect of consciousness involved in attraction, charisma, and romantic connection. But here's where it gets really interesting. Modern practitioners who work with Zephyr report improvements in social confidence, better understanding of relationship dynamics, and enhanced capacity for emotional intimacy. The magic isn't supernatural, it's psychological. By consciously engaging with the archetypal patterns associated with love and attraction, practitioners develop these capacities within themselves. You can feel this principle at work in your own life. Think about times when you've been naturally charismatic and attractive to others. You weren't faking it or using techniques. You were accessing an archetypal pattern that exists within your consciousness. The Zephyr work simply provides a systematic way to access that state more consistently. Or take Orobas, described as a great prince who appears as a horse but can take human form. Orobas is said to give true answers about divinity and the creation of the world, to provide dignities and prelacies, and to protect against deception by evil spirits. In modern terms, Orobas represents the wise counselor within, the aspect of consciousness that can perceive truth clearly and provide reliable guidance. Working with Orobas involves developing discernment, learning to distinguish between authentic spiritual insight and wishful thinking or emotional projection. Practitioners report enhanced ability to make good decisions, better resistance to manipulation, and clearer understanding of spiritual and philosophical questions. You already have access to this Orobas function. It's that inner voice that warns you about people who aren't trustworthy, or that sudden clarity that emerges when you're facing a difficult decision. The Goetic approach simply provides tools for accessing this wisdom more deliberately. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating, and this insight will revolutionize how you approach personal development. Modern chaos magicians and psychological magicians have discovered that the specific mythological details of the Goetic spirits are less important than the underlying psychological functions they represent. Some practitioners work with the traditional imagery and narratives, while others create entirely new symbolic representations of the same archetypal patterns. This flexibility reveals something crucial about how these systems actually work. The power isn't in the specific symbols or rituals. It's in the conscious engagement with different aspects of psychological and spiritual capacity. Imagine consciousness as a vast instrument with 72 different keys. The traditional Goetic imagery provides one way to play these keys, but once you understand the underlying musical principles, you can create your own composition. Some modern practitioners work with the spirit Furfur, traditionally described as an earl who appears as a hart with a fiery tail, speaking in a rough voice until commanded to take human shape. Instead of the traditional imagery, they might visualize Furfur as a wise therapist or a lightning storm. Any symbol that effectively represents the transformative energy associated with truth-telling and the dissolution of illusion. What matters is the practical result: enhanced capacity for honest communication, ability to see through deception, and courage to speak difficult truths when necessary. This adaptability suggests that the ancient compilers of the Goetia understood something profound about the relationship between symbol and psyche. They weren't creating rigid dogma. They were providing flexible tools for consciousness development that could adapt to different individuals and cultural contexts. You use this principle naturally without realizing it. When you think of courage, you might picture a lion, a warrior, or a mountain. Different people connect with different imagery, but the underlying psychological function, the activation of brave, confident energy, remains the same. Let's examine some of the most profound spirits and their modern applications, because understanding these archetypal patterns will give you access to psychological resources you've been carrying within yourself your entire life. Paimon, described as a marquis, who appears as a wolf with a serpent's tail, vomiting flames, represents the reconciliation of opposites, the ability to find harmony between conflicting forces. Modern practitioners work with Ammon for conflict resolution, negotiation skills, and the integration of shadow aspects of personality. Picture yourself in a situation where you need to bridge completely different perspectives, maybe mediating between family members or finding common ground in a business negotiation. Accessing your inner Paimon means activating a part of your consciousness that can see the valid elements in opposing viewpoints and find creative solutions that honor everyone's needs. Barbados, a great duke who appears when the sun is in Sagittarius, is said to teach understanding of the singing of birds and the voices of animals. In psychological terms, Barbados represents deep ecological consciousness and the ability to perceive patterns in natural systems. Contemporary practitioners report enhanced intuitive connection with nature, better environmental awareness, and improved ability to work with natural cycles and rhythms. You feel your Barbados function when you're in nature and suddenly understand something about life that can't be put into words. When watching the movement of clouds or the behavior of animals provides insights into your own situation. This isn't mystical fantasy. It's the activation of pattern recognition systems that evolved over millions of years of human interaction with natural environments. Bael, described as a mighty duke appearing as a many-headed lion, is associated with healing and the revelation of hidden treasures. Modern applications include therapeutic work, the uncovering of psychological insights, and the development of healing abilities, not necessarily supernatural healing, but the enhanced capacity to create conditions that support recovery and growth. Think about times when your presence has been genuinely healing for someone else, when your attention, compassion, or insight has helped another person feel better or gain clarity. That's your Bael function in operation. Working with this archetype means consciously developing your capacity to create healing environments and relationships. Each of these archetypal patterns represents a specific type of psychological and spiritual capacity that can be developed through conscious engagement. The traditional ritual frameworks provide one approach to this development, but the underlying principles can be applied through many different methods. Here's what modern neuroscience tells us about how these systems might actually work. And this scientific validation will completely transform how you understand the relationship between ancient wisdom and contemporary psychology. Recent research in cognitive psychology has revealed that the brain operates through multiple processing networks that often function independently of conscious awareness. We have systems for pattern recognition, emotional processing, social intelligence, creative synthesis, and many other cognitive functions. Imagine your brain as a vast orchestra with different sections: strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion. Most people only consciously conduct a few instruments at a time, but the full orchestra is always available. The Goetic approach provides sheet music for conducting the entire ensemble. The Goetic approach to consciousness development involves consciously engaging with these different processing systems through symbolic and ritualistic means. The elaborate visualizations, invocations, and ceremonial actions serve to activate specific neural networks and cognitive functions. This is similar to what happens in therapeutic techniques like Jungian active imagination, Gestalt therapy work with subpersonalities, or internal family systems therapy. All of these approaches recognize that healthy psychological functioning involves conscious relationship with different aspects of self. The advantage of the Goetic system is its comprehensiveness and sophistication. The 72 spirits provide a detailed map of human psychological and spiritual capacities. Working with this system over time can lead to the development of a much fuller range of human potential than most people ever access. Dr. Jordan Peterson's work on archetypal psychology and the psychological significance of mythological systems provides a modern academic framework for understanding how these ancient technologies might function. Peterson argues that mythological narratives encode practical wisdom about psychological development, and that engaging with these narratives can facilitate personal growth. But here's what Peterson doesn't fully explore. The Goetic system isn't just about understanding mythological narratives intellectually. It's about actively engaging with these archetypal patterns to develop specific psychological capacities. It's applied mythology rather than theoretical mythology. The spirits of the Goetia function similarly. They're not literal entities, but rather symbolic representations of psychological patterns and capacities that can be developed through conscious engagement. You can verify this in your own experience. When you consciously engage with archetypal imagery, whether through meditation, creative visualization, or artistic expression, you often notice shifts in your psychological state and capabilities. The ancient compilers of the Goetia simply systematized and refined these naturally occurring processes. Let's explore the darker aspects that most practitioners won't discuss openly, because true psychological development requires engaging with the complete spectrum of human nature, not just the socially acceptable parts. Working with Goetic systems does involve engaging with what Jung called the shadow, the rejected and undeveloped aspects of personality. Some of the spirits represent psychological functions that mainstream culture considers problematic or dangerous. Picture the parts of yourself you've been taught to hide or suppress. Your capacity for anger, strategic manipulation, sexual desire, ruthless competition, or destructive creativity. These aren't inherently evil aspects of human nature. They're psychological functions that can be expressed constructively or destructively, depending on the level of consciousness involved. Take Belphegor, described as appearing as a beautiful naked woman, and associated with ingenious inventions and wealth-bringing discoveries. Belphegor also represents the capacity for strategic manipulation and the use of sexual energy for practical goals. Working with Belphegor can develop charisma and persuasive ability, but it also involves confronting one's capacity for manipulation and deception. You already express Belphegor energy, whether you're conscious of it or not. Every time you present yourself strategically in a job interview, use charm to influence a social situation, or channel sexual attractiveness for personal goals. The question isn't whether you have these capacities. It's whether you engage with them consciously or unconsciously. Similarly, Andras, who appears as an angel with the head of an owl, riding a black wolf, and carrying a bright sword, represents the warrior aspect, the capacity for strategic conflict, and the willingness to destroy what needs to be destroyed. This includes psychological patterns, relationships, or life circumstances that no longer serve growth and development. You feel Andras energy when you finally get angry enough about a toxic situation to take decisive action. When you end a relationship that's become harmful, leave a job that's crushing your spirit, or confront someone who's been taking advantage of your kindness. That capacity for necessary destruction is an essential aspect of psychological health. Many practitioners are uncomfortable with these shadow aspects and try to work only with the positive spirits. But this approach misses the point of the system. Complete psychological development requires integration of the full range of human capacities, including those that might be socially problematic when expressed unconsciously. The key is conscious relationship with these energies rather than unconscious expression. Someone who works with Andras consciously develops the capacity for appropriate assertion and the willingness to end relationships or situations that have become toxic. Someone who expresses Andras unconsciously becomes destructive and violent. The ancient compilers of the Goetia understood that spiritual development requires engagement with the complete spectrum of human potential, light and dark, creative and destructive, harmonious and conflicted. Now let's examine the most advanced applications of this ancient technology, because what I'm about to describe represents the pinnacle of human psychological development. Master practitioners of Goetic systems report that extended work with these archetypal patterns leads to what might be called psychological sovereignty. The ability to consciously access whatever psychological and spiritual resources a situation requires. Imagine having conscious access to 72 different modes of being, 72 different ways of engaging with life, depending on what's needed in any given moment. Instead of being limited to habitual personality patterns, advanced practitioners can shift into whatever archetypal mode would be most effective. Think about how transformative this would be in your own life. Facing a leadership challenge, access the strategic intelligence of Bael. Supporting someone through grief, embody the healing presence of Marbas. Need to make a difficult transition? Channel the transformative fire of Phoenix. This isn't multiple personality disorder. It's conscious psychological flexibility. The different archetypal modes remain integrated within a coherent sense of self, but that self becomes much more multidimensional and capable. Some practitioners report that this work leads to what they describe as archetypal consciousness, direct awareness of the psychological and spiritual patterns that underlie individual personality. From this perspective, individual identity becomes more fluid and creative, while remaining grounded in deeper levels of awareness. This aligns with descriptions from advanced practitioners of other spiritual traditions. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of the development of deity yoga, the ability to consciously embody different enlightened qualities. Hindu Tantra describes similar practices for engaging with different divine aspects. The Western grimoire tradition represents another approach to the same fundamental understanding about the multidimensional nature of consciousness. But here's the part that will completely revolutionize how you understand human potential. This isn't just theoretical possibility. These capacities exist within you right now, waiting to be developed and expressed. You already shift between different archetypal modes naturally without realizing it. The part of you that emerges during creative projects is different from the aspect that handles financial planning, which is different from the energy you access during intimate conversations. The Goetic system simply provides tools for making these natural shifts more conscious and intentional. Here's something that will challenge everything you think you know about Western esotericism, and this revelation will change how you understand your own cultural inheritance. The grimoire tradition, including the Ars Goetia, represents one of the most sophisticated psychological and spiritual technologies ever developed in the West. But because it's been misunderstood as primitive superstition or dangerous occultism, its genuine insights have been largely lost to mainstream culture. What we're looking at is actually an advanced form of applied psychology that predates modern therapeutic approaches by centuries. The systematic categorization of psychological functions, the use of symbolic imagery to access unconscious resources, the integration of ritual and visualization for consciousness development. These are all cutting-edge approaches. Imagine if you discovered that your ancestors had developed sophisticated technologies for consciousness development that make modern psychology look primitive by comparison. That's exactly what we're dealing with when we examine the grimoire tradition with clear eyes. The tragedy is that this wisdom tradition has been driven underground by religious persecution and cultural misunderstanding. Generations of practitioners have had to work in secret, passing on their knowledge through encoded texts and oral traditions. But in our current historical moment, there's an opportunity for this ancient wisdom to emerge from the shadows and contribute to our understanding of human potential. As mainstream culture becomes more psychologically sophisticated and spiritually open, the genuine insights of the grimoire tradition can be integrated with modern therapeutic and developmental approaches. This doesn't mean uncritical acceptance of every aspect of traditional practice. Some elements reflect the limitations of their historical context and need to be updated or transformed. But the core insights about consciousness development and psychological integration remain profoundly valuable. You can see evidence of this integration already happening in various fields. Jungian psychology, transpersonal therapy, and consciousness research are all rediscovering principles that were systematically developed in the grimoire tradition centuries ago. The question is whether you'll be part of this rediscovery process, whether you'll explore the psychological technologies that are your birthright as a Western person, or whether you'll remain limited to the narrow range of consciousness development approaches that mainstream culture currently accepts. Let me share the most important thing you need to understand about working with these systems safely and effectively, because this knowledge could save you years of confusion and potentially dangerous experimentation. The key to beneficial engagement with Goetic systems is approaching them as consciousness development tools rather than supernatural practices. This means taking personal responsibility for your psychological and spiritual development, rather than hoping that external entities will solve your problems. Picture the difference between asking a wise teacher to do your homework versus asking them to help you understand the principles so you can solve problems yourself. The first approach creates dependency and doesn't lead to real learning. The second approach develops genuine capability. Traditional grimoire practices often emphasize commanding and controlling spirits, but this approach reflects an adversarial relationship with aspects of self. More effective is an approach based on cooperation and integration. When working with any of the 72 spirits, the goal isn't to get them to do things for you. It's to develop the psychological and spiritual capacities they represent within yourself. This requires consistent practice, honest self-reflection, and willingness to grow and change. You need to understand that this work isn't about quick fixes or magical solutions. It's about systematic development of psychological and spiritual capacities over time. The practitioners who get the best results are those who approach it as a long-term consciousness development practice, rather than a shortcut to getting what they want. It's also crucial to maintain grounding in ordinary reality. These practices are meant to enhance normal human functioning, not replace it with fantasy or delusion. The most effective practitioners integrate their spiritual work with practical life skills, healthy relationships, and meaningful contribution to their communities. Finally, it's important to understand that this work can bring up intense psychological material. Working with shadow aspects of personality, confronting limiting beliefs, and developing new capacities can be challenging. Having adequate support systems and possibly professional therapeutic guidance can be invaluable. The spirits of the Goetia represent aspects of human potential that most people never develop. Engaging with these systems can lead to profound personal transformation, but that transformation needs to be integrated wisely within the context of a balanced and grounded life. You might be wondering, is this safe? Is this something you should explore? The answer depends entirely on your approach and intentions. If you're looking for magical solutions to avoid personal responsibility, this work isn't for you. But if you're genuinely interested in developing the full spectrum of human psychological and spiritual capacity, these ancient technologies can be profoundly valuable. So what does all this mean for you personally? And this is where everything we've discussed comes together into practical wisdom you can use immediately. Whether or not you ever engage directly with Goetic practices, understanding this tradition offers valuable insights into the nature of consciousness and human potential. The ancient recognition that we contain multiple psychological functions, and that these can be developed through conscious practice, remains as relevant today as it was centuries ago. Picture yourself 6 months from now, having developed conscious access to psychological resources that most people never know they possess. Imagine approaching challenges with the strategic intelligence of Bael, the healing presence of Marbus, or the transformative wisdom of Phoenix. This isn't fantasy. It's the natural result of systematic consciousness development. You don't need elaborate rituals or medieval grimoires to begin developing the archetypal capacities represented by the Goetic spirits. Simply becoming aware of different aspects of your psychological makeup and consciously cultivating underdeveloped capacities can be transformative. Perhaps you recognize that you need to develop the strategic intelligence represented by Bael, the ability to see situations clearly and make effective decisions. Or maybe you need to access the healing presence associated with Barfus, the capacity to support others through difficult transitions. The specific symbols and narratives of the Goetic tradition provide one map for understanding human potential, but the underlying insights can be applied through many different approaches. Modern therapeutic work, creative practices, spiritual disciplines, and even professional development can all benefit from this understanding of consciousness as multidimensional and developable. You already know which archetypal patterns you need to develop. Think about the challenges you're facing in your life right now, the situations where you feel stuck or limited. Each of these challenges points towards specific psychological capacities that you could develop. The ancient compilers of the Ars Goetia preserved a profound understanding of human nature that mainstream Western culture has largely forgotten. By reclaiming this wisdom, not as literal supernatural belief but as sophisticated psychology, we can access resources for growth and development that most people never realize they possess. But here's the most important part. This isn't just intellectual understanding. This is practical wisdom that you can begin applying immediately. Start paying attention to the different aspects of your personality that emerge in different situations. Notice which archetypal patterns you naturally express and which ones remain underdeveloped. As we conclude this deep exploration of the Ars Goetia, remember that the real treasure isn't in the ancient texts themselves. It's in the recognition that you contain vast untapped potential. The 72 spirits represent 72 different ways of being human, 72 different capacities that you can develop and express. Think about the person you could become if you had conscious access to the full spectrum of human psychological and spiritual capacity. Picture yourself moving through life with the wisdom to know which archetypal pattern would be most effective in any given situation, and the skill to access that pattern intentionally. This isn't about becoming someone different than who you are. It's about becoming more fully who you are. The archetypal patterns preserved in the Goetia reflect the complete spectrum of human possibility. By engaging consciously with these patterns, you can develop psychological and spiritual resources that will serve you throughout your life. The ancient wisdom keepers who compiled these texts understood something that modern culture is only beginning to rediscover: that human consciousness is far more multidimensional and capable than we typically realize. The practices they preserved offer pathways to accessing and developing these deeper capacities. Whether you approach this work through traditional ceremonial methods, modern therapeutic techniques, or simply through conscious self-development, the essential insight remains the same. You are not limited to habitual patterns of thinking, feeling, and being. You have access to the full range of human psychological and spiritual potential. The spirits of the Ars Goetia aren't external entities waiting to grant your wishes. They're aspects of your own consciousness waiting to be developed and expressed. The real magic happens when you take responsibility for your own growth and begin consciously cultivating the capacities you need to create the life you truly want. But here's the part almost no one dares to say. Once you begin this work, once you start accessing the deeper levels of your own consciousness, there is no going back to the limited way of being that most people accept as normal. You'll begin to see the vast potential that exists within every human being, and you'll understand why this knowledge has been preserved and transmitted across centuries despite persecution and misunderstanding. The question isn't whether you have access to these archetypal capacities. You do. The question is whether you'll choose to develop them consciously or remain unaware of the psychological and spiritual resources you carry within yourself. The veil between ordinary consciousness and expanded awareness is much thinner than most people realize. The ancient technologies preserved in texts like the Ars Goetia provide proven methods for crossing that threshold safely and effectively. Your journey into the depths of consciousness starts with a single recognition that you are far more than the limited identity you've been taught to accept. Within you lie dormant capacities for wisdom, power, creativity, and transformation that are waiting to be awakened. The 72 spirits of the Goetia are not external forces to be feared or commanded. They are invitations to explore the vastness of your own being. They are doorways into aspects of consciousness that most people never imagine they possess. If exploration has resonated with you, if you've felt that sense of recognition as these hidden connections have been revealed, then you're ready to take the next step. The path of consciousness development isn't for everyone, but for those who feel the call. It offers rewards beyond imagination. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced moments when you seemed to access psychological resources you didn't know you had? What archetypal patterns do you recognize in yourself that you'd like to develop further? Which of the 72 spirits calls to you most strongly? If you're ready to explore the hidden dimensions of your own consciousness, if you want to develop the psychological and spiritual capacities that most people never even know exist, then write "Awaken the Spirits Within" in the comments. I read every single response, and your engagement helps me understand what aspects of ancient wisdom you're most eager to explore. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, because we're just beginning this journey into the hidden technologies of consciousness development. Next week, we'll be exploring another suppressed wisdom tradition that holds keys to unlocking human potential. And trust me, what you'll discover will change everything you think you know about the nature of reality itself. The ancient wisdom is calling, but only you can choose to answer.